I'm Chamatya Fernando, a youth activist from Sri Lanka. And just to share a little bit about how I got into all of this work, I'm coming from a middle class family, probably a conservative background, from a mixed background. Actually, my father is a Roman Catholic and my mom is a Sinhalese Buddhist. And I was never exposed to, I didn't know what gender was, or not even exposed to comprehensive sexuality education while in school, because it was a chapter that probably was skipped. So I was really new to all of this work. But while I was in school, I did girl guiding. I mean, I started when I was around 8 years old, and then with that I was exposed to social work and working for different causes, and what's happening around the world and what are these major social issues. With that, I also got the opportunity to be a youth delegate with WAGS. That was the first time I experienced a UN space, a global kind of process where intergovernmental negotiations and how to advocate your national delegations and what gender activists are doing, what feminism is. I think the first time I was exposed to the word feminism itself was there at the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women back in 2012, 2013. And it was the first time that I learned that, there are so many people working so passionately for this cause. And, as a young person, what role should I be playing in this? So that actually led me to come back to Sri Lanka and then, initiate the Stop the Violence campaign, which was primarily to educate young people, adolescents and young people about what gender-based violence was and how should we act upon it, that, it's our duty to speak out and take action about it. I'm a member of the Generation Equality Youth Task Force and have been continuing my work in that space also.
My name is Sunita Dhar and I currently live in Delhi. I was born in the state of Jammu and Kashmir, and then my family located and migrated to Bombay, and that's where I had my education and my early activism period. As you grow up, there are expectations from your family for what you should do, what you should study. And my father was a very progressive person. He believed in equality, and so I had equal opportunities to my brother and my younger sister, and had the opportunity to learn a lot of non-traditional skills of electrical repairs and, doing other tasks for the home. And the expectation was that I'd become a doctor. I started studying science. But my heart was in something else. I didn't know what it was. It was in working on the ground. I didn't know what that meant as well. Because as Chamatya has said, I was also a girl guide in school. I was in community service. I was part of many collectives. In college days, I was president of the Students' Union. So, my association with many other activities outside of my studies was I had a very vibrant association, and therefore my interest in changing my discipline. And in my period, I'm in my mid 60s. We didn't have much knowledge about what courses were offered, etc. But anyway, I went in search of this dream. I wanted to do something different from anybody else. And I was happy that I got all the support from my family. And I'm doing what I have studied. And I have been an activist. I have been engaged with political processes of the social movements, many social movements, women's movements. And I then, in my professional capacity, have worked with community-based organizations. I have worked in resettlement colonies, in slums. I have worked with national NGOs and have picked up a lot of skills on the way. I was also the coordinator of the Beijing conference in India and worked very closely with South Asian feminist colleagues in the region and then, of course, around the globe. And later on, my journey took me to the UN as well, and I was the manager of the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women. Unfortunately, for the last 1 year, my activism is largely online, which I regret very deeply. I miss being on the streets. I miss the vibrancy of the collective voices, the singing together, the marches, the celebrations, the resistance. first time in my professional and personal life, I had the opportunity of being engaged with the UN process, working in South Asia and working at the country level, community level, as I mentioned, was already there. I was heading a special unit that was set up in India by a coalition of donors to facilitate the voices and participation of grassroots women from India. Let me focus on 2 or 3 things. One of them was that the Beijing conference had a poster which said, looking at the world through eyes of women. And the question I think I asked, and many of us asked, was eyes of which women? So it was important for us to make sure that unlike the conferences of the past, where only those that had access to a certain language, to travel, to resources, to research opportunities, to working at a global level, how could we open up a space where those that never knew about the United Nations, leave alone, what conferences are about, leave alone ever going abroad, how could we get the voices of these diverse women, whether they were from the mountains, from the desert areas, from the arid areas, from, fisher folks? So we looked at women in all their occupational identities. We reached out to women in all their geographies, tribal women, rural women, indigenous women, urban women. Our outreach was phenomenal. We traveled extensively. We combined thematics. We looked at economic rights. We looked at social rights. We looked at empowerment. We looked at changes they were making. At the same time as we were reaching out to communities in the country, even those that were in conflict zones and those that were in humanitarian conditions, those that were evicted, those that were, struggling to build their homes. And we were also engaging with the national process and the international process. So we were creating the spaces for the voices to be represented at the policy level so that when the India country paper goes out, it is truly embodying the experiences from a large country like India. So politically, we were transforming a landscape. At the level of process, we were transforming the notions of inclusion, participation, co-creating a new process. We were not talking of tokenism. We were not talking about taking grassroots women to Beijing, and then we will present on those that, have the language will present on their behalf. We were talking about ways and means by which they would be the leaders would speak for themselves, and we would create a support system for them to be able to talk about their own issues. So nothing, for us, without us, kind of a concept that has come much later. At the same time, we also had a phenomenal experience with partnerships. Who could we bring around the table? So the donor community also brought many donors around the table, breaking the silos of only funding their own partners. So we were not talking of every donor funding their own grantees. We said, put it into a pool and let a transparent process be put into place, which actually the donors assisted us. We had fabulous partnerships with many of the gender experts in the donor community to take this process forward. And at the end of the day, I think we also learned that, nobody gives you rights. Nobody calls you for an event. You claim your rights. So if you go to a meeting and they invite 5 people, then you say, no, but I'm going to bring 15 people. There are so many of them there. So how to leverage every opportunity for wider representation and diversity. I didn't know the word intersectionality then. We learned it much later. But I think the principles were embedded there, that we need to make sure that everybody's around the table.
Beijing stands as one of the most comprehensive, documents, policies we have. And it has impacted so many lives. Probably now that we are in this space, we learn about what kind of impact it had over the years. Yes, of course, there's so much more to be done in all of this. But having said that, I think it's so important that young people, and even to share this with adolescents and who will be taking even after us to kind of lead this path. It's important to share these amazing stories and how it was. For me, at least, I was exposed to Beijing during 2014, 2015, when 20th Beijing review process happened. For me, that was the first time that I came across Beijing, and to see these passionate, determined activists really leading that path, and also how they also involved young activists like us in that conversation, giving us that space and kind of enabling us to be in that. I also see the kind of conversations we have on intergenerational gap, and how can we have this co-creation and co-leadership in these spaces. And from my experience, I know that so many activists, not just from Sri Lanka, but even from South Asia and around the world, have really enabled me, shared their knowledge and skills with me. And the kind of support I've had from them is really something that has struck with me. I hope that one day, probably in the next 25 years, I would also be having a conversation like this, with another young activist to tell about what it was like for me, like, listening to what Sunita is now sharing, because that's something I think would kind of make us more inspired to continue this journey, and to see how important it is to bring all those voices, probably the ones who don't have their voices in this table, to make sure that these faces are representative and diverse and also inclusive.
The Beijing process led to also new organizations being formed on the ground, because it gave momentum to collective voices and to so many meetings and thinking and ideation and campaigning, that a generation of new organizations were also formed post-Beijing that have completed 25 years now in different parts of the country. And I think that has been an enormous gain of the process, because until young women run their own institutions, or community leaders run their own processes, change will not come. It's not going to come from above. It's going to come from your own efforts, your own struggles, your own vision, your own ability to transform the patriarchal, gendered society. Feminism is a journey. To me, the personal is political becomes an extremely important part to feminism, because it's not something that you do to others. It's an ism you follow because you yourself are committed to bringing about change. So I do want to say that we were young then. 1995, many of us were young women. We learned a lot. And it is mentorship. It is an intergenerational process. Before leaving for Beijing, we invited some of our very esteemed, lovable senior colleagues who had been to the previous conferences to share with us what the journey was like. What could we learn from it? What is the politics that we should keep in mind, global, national, otherwise? And I think that storytelling that Chamatya is talking about, I think is an extremely important part of recalling what worked, what may not have worked, and what might be ways to move forward. Thank you, Chamatya, for saying that. I thought that was very nice. We all know that it is feminists that really brought out the issue of violence against women. And for a long time, we continue to use the word violence against women and girls, which doesn't mean that it's only about women, because feminism is an inclusive ideology. It's about a thought process, a mindset, a commitment to to change, transforming structures and institutions. But I know that gender-based violence is a more inclusive terminology, because we have all moved beyond the binary, and we are talking about queer, trans, indigenous, women with disabilities, young women, and gender non-conforming groups. And so I think it's important that we understand that the root cause of violence is basically, fundamentally, it's a relationship of power, domination, oppression, which makes some people inferior to others. And then it is sanctioned politically, socially, and through the institutions of society. That socialization results in women and girls in their diversity, thinking that they are less capable and they're meant for certain roles in society. So I think we have to understand that it is a structural form of violence. It's not a violence faced by one person or a group of persons. It is targeted violence. And, and the more vulnerable a background you come from, Dalit women, indigenous women, Adivasi women, positive women, women who are sex workers, women with disabilities, trans women, they face far more violence than women. So we do understand that while all face violence, the nature of violence differs depending on who you are, your identities, your location, and where you are in the context of your environment. The other thing that I think we need to understand that if we do not look at violence with a feminist lens, we may be falling into a trap of a dominant patriarchal analysis. And therefore, it's very important to not only look at violence from a feminist lens, but also from the lens of racism, from the lens of casteism, from the lens of other, as we say, intersectional lens, to understand how gendered power shapes every interaction in society. We have to unpack the nature of this kind of power relationship, whether it's within the family or it's in the community or at the workspace, etc. We have to begin to see how violence is embedded in all institutions, in all structures, in all sectors, and how it promotes superiority of some over the other, whether it's through the language, it's through the policy formulation, and as I said, through the legal framework. And it is that violence that we have to speak about. Violence takes place in multiple sites, within the homes, within the communities, in the public space, in the workspace. There's a continuum of violence that is taking place. And it is the structural form of violence that we should be addressing and working on in the future.
Recently we did a study in Sri Lanka where 96% of women said that they experience sexual harassment on a daily basis when they travel by public transport or even, walking on the streets. So we see that the kind of harassment and violence that day-to-day girls and women face. And we know that what kind of really the challenges and the causes that lead into them experiencing that. As a young girl, when I traveled in the bus, I didn't know that if somebody was touching me in an inappropriate way, that it was wrong and I must speak out. And that's something I learned. And then I made sure that I'm going to speak out even for others. And that's something even with our campaign, what we try to do is to really break that culture of silence, ignorance, impunity and acceptance. You see that a lot of people just normalize this. So, it's something that's happening in the house. It's something to deal with, husband and wife. It's not none of our business. Or, you see that people see it in the bus and they just ignore, saying it's not my business. I think you need to break that. You need to break that silence. That's something I think as young feminists or adolescents in this movement, something we are really focusing about to really give that kind of energy and power for young people to take action, to speak out. I think as young people or adolescents, all need to come together to really campaign for this negative stereotyping and influence we see on media, or we sometimes see that how, these advertisements that comes out already kind of try to build in our minds that these are for women, these are for men, and this is your role in the society, and this is and we try to put them in boxes. Also, I think demanding for equal opportunities, not just in education, but also in the workspace, and making sure that women are economically independent. I think poverty also has led to women being vulnerable to, violence, and how can we make sure that they have access to support services if they come across this kind of issues, and also making sure that they're able to have equal opportunities to not just work, but also to be economically independent.
Very well said. Can I just add a few lines? Because I think, Chamate, you so beautifully talked about the impacts of gender-based violence and what can be done to prevent it and to address it. I must say, in the context of the pandemic today, we are forgetting that gender-based violence family violence, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and other forms of violence were already, it was a pandemic, but it was never declared one. Even the latest data from WHO says 1 in 3 women, and particularly young women, experience violence, different forms of violence in their lifetime. Amongst the changes that we need to bring about fundamentally is this division in society that we make between the public and the private. The public space is for a certain gender, a certain, you design the public space also with a privileged white man, as they say in Europe, with the notion of a white man using it. You never think about other genders and the diverse other people that would use it. So the division between the public and the private, where women are supposed to take care of the home and children, and there's a certain role that she has to play so that society can continue, needs to be broken, because you're not born into a certain gender. You may be born into a certain, what they call sex. You may, change it in time to come depending on your own orientation. But gender is a learned behavior. Violence is learned. You're not born a perpetrator. Nobody is born a perpetrator. You pick it up from socialization, messaging, and other acts of violence in and around you that, so rightly Chamatya has said, is normalized. So breaking the binary between the public and private is important so that all genders are equally part of the public space and the private space, which means taking care of your home, family, care work. We have suddenly in this pandemic and work from homes thought about care work and what it means. The second division that we have to break is between the productive work and the reproductive work. The productive work is of a higher value. It has better returns, economically, so to say. And the reproductive and everyday chores, giving value to all forms of labor, women's unpaid labor, underpaid labor, care labor, should become part of economic theory. And we have to look at what economic recovery packages can be thereof. The third thing we have to break are the traditional norms that say, don't speak about your family. How can you talk about your family? I mean, where will you go? The family is supposed to be the best space in society, right? And the safest site, which most women and girls, and even those young boys sometimes, testify to family being the first site of violence. And so learning to speak out against a family member, a partner, a parent, a grandparent, other relatives, male and female, etc., also requires, as Chamatya said so well, breaking a silence. It requires a power of its own kind. And where will this power come from unless there are collectives of women around, unless there's a redressal system, unless there's a safe space that she can go to, that she will otherwise be within that same space, suffering it, not knowing where to go. And that is why domestic violence is not family violence, domestic violence, intimate partner violence. These are not personal issues. These are human rights violation. And the minute we call it a crime, a targeted crime against women and other genders, we will begin to redevelop our response systems with access to, restorative justice, with access to services by the state, not just women's organization, you take care of it. It's a women's issue, you do what you have to do. We're not going to put any resources into it. So gender-based violence, fundamentally, it's an issue of society, it's an issue of the state, it's an issue of governance, and it requires resources and collective political will to be able to handle it at all levels.
Something working in the Generation Equality Youth Task Force, we constantly was mindful was how gender could be cross-cutting and how different constituencies really need to be included and be represented in these spaces. And we ensured that even the Youth Task Force was as diverse and inclusive space to to have all these constituencies represented, starting from indigenous youth to LGBTQI to young people living with disabilities to young people coming from islands. We wanted all of these voices to be in those spaces because it's important for us to hear from them. Their voices need to be on the table rather than somebody sitting in a desk and working on different issues, coming and saying, we think that these are the issues that these people are facing. We need to bring them to the table, and that has also shaped the anti-GBV movement, but also we see hugely a lack of representation. And one thing that we definitely need to have is that intersectional analysis of GBV, which kind of, how to challenge the dominant, depoliticized framing of sexual violence as an interpersonal issue. By kind of revealing those structural dimensions and the kind of intersections with systems of oppression we see. I also feel that the same point that we bring with youth leadership is it can't be tokenistic, just for the sake of having somebody in the table or in a space just to tick a box. You can't bring them. It needs to be that real idea of having these people shaping all this agenda, the policies, the decision-making spaces. It needs to be meaningful engagement, meaningful space for them to really co-create and co-lead these spaces. So I feel that it has, really come out as a strong area that we need to focus over the last few years.
No concept is static, and nothing in life can be learned in one go, right? So we're always learning about what and truly how to translate intersectionality in its true spirit and to live it and to practice it, not just to talk about it, right? What is it that I'm learning? One is that the experience of violence, discrimination, are subjective experiences, right? They're not the same. They may have similar experiences, but not the same. My privileges, my social location, my access to certain opportunities and my class, etc., mediate my experience of violence, mediate my access to services or to justice. So to understand my own privileges and to understand that I have to unpack my privileges, my location, my biases, to understand what does it mean for women who don't have similar opportunities and do not stand in the same space. So I think one has to really understand the lived realities, the perspectives, and have a very deep knowledge of what women experience located where they are, collectively and individually. When we start looking at data on violence, for instance, the government data, and you see which women most experience sexual assault and rape, and the data shows you very clearly who those women are. And you begin to see how class domination, how caste domination plays a role in violating women who are located within certain structures of society and who are absolutely on the margins of society, and yet we do not want to name them. And lastly, I think it really challenges all of us to say we have to co-create. We have to be in solidarity also means to learn, to walk behind, to walk with, but not to lead. And I think that's a lesson to learn, that to be able to give up privileges, to be able to share them, to be able to acknowledge them, and then to be able to understand what happens.
Me too definitely did see a lot of women and girls coming out and saying that how we saw that how much people have experienced this, and it was something that struck me because to see the kind of impact it had in terms of people kind of breaking that silence, people who've been vulnerable to such situations, but really now getting that power to come out and say, yes, I've also experienced that. I think as a social movement against sexual abuse and sexual harassment, where people kind of publicize allegations of sex crimes, and then to really how we were able to hold some organizations, some institutions accountable. I saw how different media organizations, film industries, entertainment industry were held accountable to some of the practices they had, probably sexualizing, objectifying women in media, and how also some of the women who worked in those spaces were abused and had to experience harassment in the workspace. Because I feel also that a lot of women, sometimes especially young women and vulnerable women, don't come out to express the kind of harassment that they face. But what we saw with Me Too movement is that women really saying, this is enough. We are done waiting to kind of break our silence. Right now, I'm going to stand in solidarity and say that this is a global issue. It's not just something that happened with that specific case. Overall, around the world, we saw girls and women coming out and saying, we have also experienced this and we need to take action. One area we constantly push for is the sexual harassment in digital or online spaces, which probably is not covered in some of the policies and documents we have developed in the past years, because that was not a space that people were actively using at that time. But right now we have a huge population actively using digital spaces, online spaces, and we also see the cyberbullying, sexual harassment in the internet and social media, and how sometimes especially girls and young women are vulnerable to such issues. So it's important for us to highlight such issues and take those into the table, and to say that we need to ensure that these also are covered in our policies for them to be as comprehensive.
Me Too movement was certainly a landmark movement. I think it provided a very, very important platform for survivors of sexual harassment at the workplace, within universities, film industry, academia, and other spaces, so to speak. And it allowed for that kind of solidarity and voicing of the harm and the impact it left on survivors over a period of time that affected their professional lives, their personal lives, their ability to build deep relationships, their distrust of the state, the system, the workplace. So while it did that, I think, what did it amplify? What did it bring into light? It brought into light that we had laws from a certain period of time only. So many survivors are speaking about their intimidation, sexual assault, misogyny at the workplace, everyday sexism from before the law was formulated. Because there was no redressal system, there was no solidarity. They didn't have a platform or a friend or a collective to speak to. It was in their hearts. It was very, very painful. So on the one hand, it allowed for a level of sharing that this happened to me. On the other hand, it highlighted the fact that the system had completely failed them, especially for survivors that were speaking of a period when the law was in place. For all the work that the women's movement has done on legal reforms, we know the Beijing Plus 25 reports acknowledges it, that the laws are not implemented. The point is that on the one hand, some people felt, but we must respect the due process. We must allow for the due process to take place. On the other hand, when the due process is not functioning, then what do? You speak up, because speaking out is an important way of bringing to the world's attention the issue of unaddressed forms of violence. On the other hand, we also saw that many women who were living on the margins of societies, women in the informal sector, domestic workers, women in sex work, Dalit women, Adivasi women, indigenous women, etc., trafficked women from the queer community, LGBTQI women, etc. They found that they didn't have a platform because the stigmatization of their voices, if they were to speak out. So a campaign about We Too also emerged in the context of Me Too. Who's listening to our voices? Where is our forum? How do we amplify it? And so therefore you began to see the divides of those that had access to platforms on social media and those that didn't. And you saw it much more clearly in the context of the COVID pandemic. It allowed for the system to respond to the fact, what are we doing at our workplace? First of all, to define what is the workplace. What is the workplace of a domestic worker? She's working in someone's home. Even though it's in the law, it's ambiguous. What is the workplace of a woman sex worker? Does she not experience violence even if she consents to a sexual relationship? She's not consenting for violence. She's not consenting for rape, right? So it brought out issues of deepened our understanding of what is consent, what is sexual assault, what are the redressal systems, who are these redressal systems for, how are at the local level, at the state level, at the national level, who are the agencies, how do you access them? So this conversation, this journey, it put on alert all the systems. So I think what it has done is it has really put the spotlight on implementation, due diligence, and understanding of, everyday misogyny and sexism at the workplace cannot be tolerated. Women have a right to be at a workplace. Of course, we have to work intergenerationally, intersectionally, intercommunity, inter whatever language we may use. Because I think the gains that have been made should not be rolled back. The younger women, along with all the new issues that they have analyzed and are cropping up in society, they also have to take forward the very complex movement and the struggle for gender justice and equality and development and peace, which they are. I mean, I'm amazed at the leadership that I have seen in the last some years, and more so in the context of the Generation Equality Forum. But I think that it is not about displacing someone and replacing someone. It is about a continued journey, a journey where you pick up the lessons of the past, you use whatever is meaningful, you make a new pathway, and you move ahead. And the other generation also has a lot to learn. What can it give? How can it give? What does mentoring really mean? How can you truly be, a comrade in arms and not just, talk about theory? So walking the talk is important. Learning from the past about historical and gender injustices is important. Building on the theories that have been built so far and elaborating it, taking it forward, nuancing it, rebuilding it, taking it apart is all part of the new journey for the younger women and men, because in the journey of feminism, there are men, women, and those that belong to different genders and sexual orientation. And I think it's very important to value diversity, to respect it, but also to build on commonalities. What will bring us together? There will be differences, there will be disagreements, but are there peaceful ways of negotiation, of dialogue, building new cultures of peace? I think there's a lot that can be done.
Definitely something I see is that how we could have this mentoring and capacity strengthening that we could have, which could actually bring in that friendly in solidarity space among everyone. And I think also it's important to see how we could strengthen young feminists to be able to participate and meaningfully engage by providing them the required resourcing and funding, and how we could best look at their meaningful engagement, because sometimes we see that young feminists and adolescents might not have that resources to be able to be part of these processes, these spaces. Also about giving them that right space to co-lead and co-create together with everyone, because they bring in their own set of experience, and we sometimes hear that they have to always break that the idea of not having enough experience and therefore not having that power to speak out and make equal decisions. So I think we've already achieved so much in that space, and it's important for us to recognize on having them in these spaces and equally contributing to it, and actually being a partner more than just a voice or more than just being consulted, to really be able to contribute and work together to push the agenda. My experience actually, and if I am to share with anyone, is to be open and reach out, basically, because I'm sure they will be more than happy to guide and work together with you in this process.